Hello, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're joining us on YouTube, thanks for being here today. I'm Josh Bertram. I'm the faithful host, and we have with us, as always, our political host, Will. It's good to see you, Will.
Yeah, same.
Thank you. And today on our show, we have Dr. Leon Aron. I should have asked you how to pronounce that before I went live. Is that Aron?
We're on the right track. Aron is the correct
Aron. There you go. Aron. I love it. And Dr. Aron is a senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute, AEI. He has expertise in Russian domestic politics, foreign policy, U.S.-Russian relations, post-Soviet evolution, and social, cultural, and economic aspects. He was born in Moscow and came to the United States as a refugee in 1978. And from 2014 to 2020, Dr. Aron was a governor of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which oversees the operations of several international broadcasting outlets, including Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. He's also a prolific writer and editor, and his books include Roads to the Temple, Memory, Truth, Ideas, and Idols in the Making of Russian Revolution, Russia's Revolution, Essays 1989 through 2006, Yeltsin, A Revolutionary Life, and many others that he's edited and parts that he has written. So thank you so much for being on the program with us. We can't wait to have this conversation with you. Can I call you Leon?
Yes.
Well, Leon, thank you so much for being here. So tell me, what was it like to grow up? Tell me, just to have the audience get a little bit more acquainted with you. I gave them just a brief little biography there that hardly touches the surface, I'm sure, of your expertise and experience in life. So help us understand kind of who is Leon Aron.
Leon Aron arrived in the United States with a suitcase, $100, no passport, and a refugee visa.
Oh my word!
But fortunately, blessed be this country. A month later, I was enrolled in undergraduate studies at Columbia University in New York, from where I got eventually a doctorate in political sociology and media sociology. I grew up in a relatively, in a very happy family with two doctors as my parents. Doctors are not what they are in the Soviet Union. In the United States. It took my parents 20 years to save for a tiny car. My father being a surgeon and my mother being a neurologist. So nevertheless, we read a lot of books, talked about things. And of course, one of the books I read while I was in college was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Gulag Archipelago. That plus some other so-called samizdat, that is underground books, persuaded me that there really no future for that regime. Of course, eventually it will disappear because it was, first and foremost, immoral. But when that would happen, I had no idea. And I decided to roll the dice. I applied to immigrate, and there were three outcomes to that. You could go to jail. You could become a known person. In other words, you were unemployable, or you could get a permission to leave. And someone interfered that would be in your province, Reverend, somebody from above.
Yes.
And I was given a visa. I was given about a month to get the hell out, which I did.
That's awesome. Wow, yeah. That's a remarkable story.
That really is. And okay, so there's a war happening in Ukraine, and I'd love to kind of get your insight, just general feelings about, Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and maybe more specifically, like, what's something you think that the American population, the American people would benefit from knowing about Putin? Because I just think it's really important that people understand who he is especially as there are debates currently in Congress about whether or not we should give money to Ukraine. So, yeah, so tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I tried to address precisely that question in my new book that's coming out in October. It's called Riding the Tiger, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the Uses of War. For several reasons, which I will explain very briefly, Putin the war became an integral part of that regime. That's the tiger. Militarized patriotism, to which Putin switched the legitimacy of his rule in his third term, starting 2012, that's the tiger. When the economy is stalling, when the economic progress is no longer the foundation of your popularity or legitimacy, what do you do? Incidentally, a fascinating case, I'm writing about this now, is very much happening like that in China, if we have time to talk about it. So what do? Well, you change the so-called social contract, which used to say, stay out of politics, let me do what I want in politics, and I will make you, if not rich, then prosperous, or at least well off, which is what happened to Putin largely because of the shooting prices of oil and gas in his first two terms, 2000 to 2008. And the contract then reads, or he rewrote that contract to read, stay out of politics and I will defend you from the West, primarily the United States, that's out to destroy Russia. Of course, this is pretty much what Xi Jinping is telling the Chinese people at the moment too. And so that's the tiger. That's the tiger that Putin settled and rather expertly made it trot in the right direction. The problem is that tiger requires fresh meat, and the bloodier and the warmer, the better. And, after a while, just saying, oh, they're threatening us, oh, they're going to attack us, and I will defend you, begins to wear off a bit. And so you hype up, you screw up the danger. And eventually that tiger, I think, took Putin to the war in Ukraine. Now, that was not the only reason. And this is something that the American people have to understand. And as Reverend pointed out, and you pointed out, the debate of what should we do about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So in addition to sustaining his regime, this war is necessary also because Ukraine is an existential threat to Putin's rule. In other words, he attacked Ukraine not for anything that Ukraine did. This is all myths. That Ukraine is about to let NATO to attack Russia from its territory. Total lies in which Putin really excels. He attacked Ukraine not for anything it did or would do. He attacked it for what it was, which is a fraternal, which is true. I mean, they're cousins of Russians, very close ethnically. A fraternal, largest country in Europe outside Russia that was clearly turning towards democracy, a rule of law, human rights, and most importantly, the West, first the EU, and eventually, although that was a very distant possibility, the NATO membership. Putin could not tolerate this country as it was because eventually the Russians would start asking, well, if Ukrainians are free and prosperous and have human rights and liberties and integrated in Europe, why can't we have that? Hey, my mother is Ukrainian. Hey, my father-in-law is Ukrainian. My cousin lives in Ukraine. So that was the second reason. But the third reason, which is not always conveyed forcefully enough, that is that Putin, as all aging autocrats, remember, he's in power for almost quarter century. He's running for his fourth term. Next year, he'll be 72 years old. He runs for history books. He feels he has a mission, and that mission is to glorify himself and bring Russia back to where his beloved motherland, remember, Putin's motherland is not Russia, it's the Soviet Union, where his beloved motherland, the Soviet Union, that was destroyed by the plotting West. Absolutely, it did not collapse, it was destroyed. Where Russia inherits the superpowership, where Russia becomes the country to reckon with, to fear, where Russia begins to be respected again in the world. How do you earn respect? We earn respect in two ways, by our friends and by our enemies. It's easier, by the way, with enemies, because you don't have, all you have to do is to say, America is my enemy, and your respect grows because you chose the richest, the most powerful country as your enemy. This is what Putin has done inside the country. All of this is to say, and this is the bottom line, I apologize for a long reply.
No, you're okay.
This war will not end in some sort of a mythical negotiations for peace. It can only end in Putin's defeat, or his sense of a defeat, which, by the way, could happen both in Ukraine and domestically in Russia. We could talk about it. He's playing a waiting game now. His only game here is to count on the Ukraine fatigue in the West. He cannot win this war otherwise. He cannot win this war, and he cannot walk away from this war. So for our politicians, for our public, remember, you cannot sweet talk Putin into admitting any kind of defeat or de facto defeat, no matter how what the context is, because that's the end of his regime. Too much is at stake. His personal place in history, the health of his regime, and his dream of the great Russia. So this is what this war is all about. The stakes are huge.
Yeah, how come we don't hear more about like the Budapest Agreement? I mean, like when the war first happened in
Sure.
Ukraine, I remember like we had another Russia expert, Judy Twigg from VCU. She's a professor of Russian studies, and we were kind of breaking apart the Budapest Memorandum, and and on one side it's like, okay, America's kind of holding up its side of the agreement, but Russia is definitely not. So I mean, like, how it just seems weird. I mean, one, I don't think most Americans know what the Budapest Memorandum is, and two, like, I'd be curious to get your thoughts if you think Russians know what the Budapest memo is.
Well, yeah, the West keeps quiet about that memorandum, and the reason for that is in one word: it's shame. America, Great Britain, and later, sort of on the margin, France and China guaranteed Ukraine's security on the 5th of December, 1994, in Budapest, Hungary, in exchange for Ukraine's giving up its nuclear weapons. Had Ukraine not done so, I don't think there would have been this war. And nothing. Those guarantees are turned out, as the Russians would say, are written with pitchforks on water. So that is the reality. The upshot of that is that Ukrainians are saying, no, the only guarantee now is a membership in NATO. So we are covered by Article 5, an attack on one, an attack on all, which incidentally is probably the only way in which we could persuade the Ukrainian leadership, after the horrendous savagery, there's no other word, savagery, barbarism, imposed on that country with the willful killing of women and children, and hospitals and restaurants and clubs by Russian missiles. We could persuade them to any kind of accommodation with Russia. That would be the only guarantee, the membership in NATO.
So it's so fascinating hearing you talk. I'm like glued to it because, number one, you were born in Russia. So you understand it to a degree that no one who's not born in Russia would understand it. Even the Russian culture, things like that. It's so fascinating. And we're talking about Putin, right? We're talking about Ukraine, and that's fresh in our minds. Maybe it should be fresher in our minds, so we can make sure that there's victory potentially for Ukraine. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. But my question, though, is how has the domestic politics and policies in Russia evolved since the fall of the quote unquote fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, 1990, something around there? How do we get here? Essentially, help us understand how we got from, oh man, democracy, it's the end of history, as Yamamuchi, or I forgot how to say his name, but it's the end of history. Democracy reigns, and now it's under attack everywhere. What do you think? What's going on?
Well, I wrote a book about this called Roads to the Temple. And it's based on a film, incidentally, with very strong and beautiful religious overtones. It's available. It's called Покаяние, or Repentance. I very strongly advise everybody to see it. And there I cite and also use for my title the penultimate line where somebody asks, where does this road lead? It's a passerby. And somebody says, well, I don't know where it leads, but it certainly does not lead to church. And the passerby says, what's the point of a road if it does not lead to church? And of course, what meant there is not just, the organized religion, but a thirst for moral living. And that is what that revolution was all about. It was not, with all due respect, about the Russians being scared of the Strategic Defense Initiative, or another argument is, they're being spent into oblivion by the United States arms race. Well, Cuba is not spent into oblivion. South Korea, North Korea, where people eat grass, is not spent into oblivion. It's the leadership understanding suddenly that there was something immoral about that regime. And once you develop a crack at the top, remember, no revolution happens, in this sort of kind of, Marxist metaphor of peasants with pitchforks storming the palaces. It's a legend. Nothing happens unless, which is why authoritarian regimes that don't crack morally, such as Cuba, North Korea, live forever. Because you can always kill enough. And by the way, that's true of the Putin regime now too. Some hesitation has to occur at the top. And it did occur. This is what my book is about. And suddenly the gates were open, and what destroyed the Soviet Union was the truth. The truth about the regime destroyed people's faith in the regime, and therefore removed the moral foundation of the regime. And no regime can exist without the moral foundation. So what happened? Well, the decade of the 1990s was a strange beast. It was the freest Russia it ever was. Ever in its 1,000 years. The fear disappeared. Total freedom of speech, total freedom of the press, competitive elections. But also at the same time, of course, the destruction of that, what the Russians used to call a cannibalistic economy. That's economy that took more in resources that then produced on the other end. And of course, millions worked in that economy. No revolution pays pensions on time or salaries on time, and you had enormous suffering. So the 90s left a very strange taste. The intelligentsia, writers, the creative class loved it. They loved it despite the economic difficulties, because finally they could write and shoot and say what they wanted. People who worked for defense factories, people who work, the pensioners, hated it because they were suddenly impoverished. And so along comes Putin, who was incredibly lucky. At the end of the Yeltsin term in 1999, oil was on average $18 a barrel. At the end of Putin's second term, it was $140 a barrel. He was extremely lucky in that ride. And also, of course, a new economy was handed to him at the end of the 90s on a silver platter. Remember, when Yeltsin took over the country, in Moscow, I saw this. On the balconies, people kept sacks of potatoes. The country was preparing for a famine. The ruble was absolutely worthless. The banks were not real banks; they were just savings for the state. So the national currency didn't exist. There was no stock exchange. There was no real banks. There were no instruments of modern economy. All of that, with great pain, was repaired, or if you say revolutionized, in the 1990s. So Putin gets this incredible ride on expensive prices of oil, and the economy with the respectable currency, private ownership, which immediately started. People forget, by the way, that the actual growth of Russian economy did not start under Putin. It started in 1999 under Yeltsin. So along comes Putin, the former KGB colonel major, and initially he looked and said the right things. But that, I think, is because that always is true of almost every modern dictator. They always start very progressively. And then the question is, what interferes? Staying in power forever. And so by the second term, you started seeing where Putin is taking country. Also, historically, every revolution is followed by restoration. I mean, name any great revolution except for the much blessed American Revolution, which was also different in every regard. That was not followed by restoration. All the rest of the great French Revolution, the great British Revolution, they were all followed by restoration. So think of it as a Putin restoration plus the revenge of the KGB elites that were masters of the country and then became nothing. The revenge on the West and the recovery of the prestige of the country. And along the way, of course, their own. So Putin really speculated and built a lot of legitimacy on the very true feelings among the Russian people as well. The sense of humiliation. We were a great country, and look at us now. We were equal to America. America is always there. I call it a battered spouse syndrome. No matter, you could love me or you could beat me so long as you notice. So this, by the way, was true of the Soviet leaders as well. So we used to be equal to America, by the way, not just militarily, but morally. We were a moral counterweight to the immoral America, and look at us now. And I can go on and on and on. Putin really speculated on true senses of humiliation and pain from the disappearance of the great power. And I think this is certainly, I listed you, there are other reasons, but this is probably how it all went.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I can't wait till your book comes out, because I definitely intend to read it. I read Fiona Hill's book about Putin, and it's a good
friend of mine.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And really kind of it's almost like Maggie Haberman's book about Confidence Man about Trump. I think Fiona Hill did a really good job just painting the picture of who Putin was, and I'm going to check out that film that you mentioned. I would even suggest to our audience, Winter on Fire is another really great documentary about Ukraine. It kind of just goes into the whole like Viktor Yanukovych era, the Maidan Revolution, and I think really colors a lot of what we see today. Talks about the invasion of Crimea or the takeover of Crimea. But
if I may recommend another book, an early book by Fiona, actually co-authored, it was called Vladimir Putin: An Operative in Power. A terrific book.
Okay.
I actually was very much inspired for my own book by reading that book.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, but I'll read both, and then if maybe you could put in a good word for us to have her.
That sounds very good. Thank you.
I know she's busy these days, but
yes, very busy.
so I want to talk real quickly about Yevgeny Prigozhin. He allegedly kind of got the window treatment by Putin, but he was a fairly big player in what's happening both in Ukraine and even in Africa. So, I'd love to kind of get your sense of, what comes next. Like, what role does the Wagner Group play in what's happening in Ukraine with him gone?
So, with the departure, let's use that euphemism.
Yeah, in quotes. Yeah.
Yes, quotes. Of and obviously almost certainly murder ordered by Putin of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Russia lost probably its finest, best motivated troops in Ukraine. So, as you know, some of them essentially were booted out. Some of them were refashioned and merged with regular troops under the Ministry of Defense, which, of course, was Prigozhin's bête noire, the group that he hated the most. But what Prigozhin, I think, did was, in other words, he opened the wound, he opened the fissure that's not going to heal very quickly. Yes, militarily, definitely, they're also, of course, refashioning his troops in Africa, where they largely served as dictators, bodyguards, probably also participant, or at least planning in recent anti-democratic coups, such as in Senegal. But what he did in domestic politics is not going to heal. And that is, he exposed the rather thin veneer of Putin's popularity. Just think of it. So here's a group of mutinous soldiers advancing towards Moscow, along the way stopping at the headquarters of one of Russia's 4 military districts, and that is Rostov-on-the-Don. Would you think that they would be met by regular soldiers firing at them, or the police, or the outrageous citizens with Putin's posters and the flags of Russia? No, the people came out, gave them candy and water, fraternized with him, and took selfies.
Yeah.
So this is something that I think scared the hell out of Putin, for which, of course, Prigozhin paid. And that is, again, remember, Putin is running for the presidency this coming spring at the age of strictly 71, but he'll be 72 next year. And even in his country, and maybe especially in his country, the memory of this sort of comatose vegetable autocrats, Brezhnev, Andropov, and before them, of course, Stalin and Kirienko, all of them were, they're seared in people's memory. It's not that easy. And so that's what scares me. Remember, one of the things for which Prigozhin paid with his life, and I think not so much actually there's a lot that he's done that Putin didn't like, but just before he started that march on Moscow, before he just blamed the Ministry of Defense, but he said something like, "This is a wrong war. This is not the war that is being described to us. Ukraine never threatened us. This war was provoked by the oligarchs and the Ministry of Defense and the generals in search of medals and orders. So that is something that Prigozhin said, and look what happened when he died. Even with the heavy police presence, his memorials, makeshift memorials, were all over Russia. So that's Yevgeny Prigozhin for you.
That's fascinating. You know, as a pastor,
correction,
go.
editorial correction. I said, when I mentioned the semi-comatose leaders, I said Kirienko. No, it's Chernenko. I'm sorry. It's the guy that was ruled for a year between Andropov and Gorbachev.
Gotcha. So I have a question about the Orthodox Church in Russia. How have they played a part in promoting or being a force against the government? What's that been like, do you think, for the Russian Orthodox Church and priests and the whole system, the religious system there? What has that been like?
Josh, it's a very sad story. In my book, there are probably half a dozen photos of Russian Orthodox priests blessing nuclear missiles with holy water, or standing there with icons. Putin, even now, he appointed a Russian saint, Seraphim of Sarov, to be the patron saint of Russian nuclear weapons. And he actually went, I have a photo. He blessed the relics, and there he is with the patriarch at that time, Alexei, praying and blessing the procession in the city of Sarov, which is Sarov, which is the capital of the Russian nuclear research. How that came about, it's a long story. The back of independent church was broken by Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, in the middle of 16th century, when he killed the last independent metropolite of Russia by the name of Philip. He either strangled him or poisoned him, first exiled him. From that point on, and then add to that Peter the Great, which has essentially made priests the state functionaries. From that point on, he created the so-called synod and paid their salaries. And so the Russian Orthodox Church is a sad story, with some notable exceptions of martyrs. A sad story of yet another state institution in the service of authoritarians. But to be honest, it's hard for me to imagine a sadder case than now, because, all right, so Stalin, Lenin and Stalin, remember, there was 90% of priests, nuns, and other servants of the church were simply killed or sent in the Gulag between 1917 and 1930, 35, and continued to be. And of course, Stalin added to it. Stalin revived the church during World War II for obvious reasons. He wanted to motivate the believers, who, of course, if they did pray, that they did it in the darkness of their kitchens. An icon in the house could send you to Gulag for 10 years. It was an officially atheistic state, actually modeled on the last years of Robespierre's French Revolution terror, where they just massacred nuns and priests. And so Stalin revived it, and it lived as an official institution after the war. What was disclosed during the time of Glasnost is that the top of the church hierarchy not only were informers and cooperated with the KGB, but some of them had ranks in the KGB. And so with all of that, growing up there, I can't imagine the support for this war is shameless. I mean, funny, in the Soviet Union, the church was used for propaganda purposes of peace. I mean, it was peace on the Soviet terms, but the priests traveled to peace groups in the West and told them about how peaceful the Soviet Union was. This is the opposite. I mean, this is blessing the killing, incidentally, of the Russian Orthodox brethren in Ukraine. I mean, which, by the way, led to a rift. They no longer recognize the authority of the Moscow Orthodox hierarchy. They created their own church, but it's still the Orthodox Church, and that the Russian priests led by Kirill, the patriarch of all Russia, would do such a thing is just mind-boggling.
Yeah. Okay. So just out of respect for time, that this would be our last question, but I have to I have to ask, like, how does this end in Ukraine? I mean, I know you alluded a little bit to it earlier, but mechanically, tactically, like how do you envision Russia's invasion of Ukraine ending? I mean, it seems like Russia kind of comes up with all these red lines. If you send tanks, that's a red line. If you send jets, that's a red line. And I know that there's this, I don't know if it's Russian propaganda, this threat of nuclear war. Oh, if you do this, I think that this came up recently with the Elon Musk thing and the Starlink, like some, defense person said, hey, if you activate the internet, it's going to unleash World War III. And, it didn't actually manifest itself. So I'm curious on how you think it's going to end.
Well, first of all, spoilers alert. I talk about this in the last chapter of my book. Mm-hmm. I'm very troubled by this. Imagine a war you cannot win and cannot walk away from. You cannot lose it because you'll be, and that's a separate issue, but the Russians forgive a lot. The Russians elite, but I can give you 5 cases of the regime change in Russia, starting, by the way, with the first Crimean War with Nicholas I, 1853 to 1856, when he lost Crimea to the Turks and the British and the French, died, and his son instituted a complete change of the regime, including the liberation of the serfs. So Khrushchev was embarrassed in Cuba in 1962. He was out 2 years later. And I could give you all kinds of examples in Russian history. So what do? Well, the first thing he counts on is the Ukraine fatigue, as I mentioned. Frankly, Trump scares me because Trump says, "Oh, I'll finish this war in 24 hours." Well, to finish this war there's only one way to finish it in the 24 hours, and that is tell President Zelenskyy, we're no longer supporting you. Go and make peace with Putin however you want. We're done with you. I mean, I don't see any other 24-hour solution. Barring that, two can play the wait game. Putin cannot wait forever. I mean, we already see sanctions are not bombs. They don't work instantly, but there's inflation. There are some shortages. You can find you can fly Russian planes on your own recognizance, as they say, because they're all foreign made and nobody services them anymore. And there are no spare parts. And some of them are way beyond their maintenance control. And so on and so forth. So he can't wait forever. And so what do? And again, with spoilers alert, I do suggest a nuclear blackmail. And that is confronting the West. And I describe how he can do it. He can couch it in all sorts of operations and terms. And I think the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are very vulnerable. In any case, he could provoke a direct confrontation with NATO. And they say, whoa, okay. We're going into the all-out nuclear war, eliminating the civilization. let's step back. Let's have a comprehensive solution, which of course would imply at least ceasefire in Ukraine, with Russia holding on pretty much to what it already has, and so on and so forth. This is a very troubling issue for me. I don't see how Putin can end this war with even a semblance of victory, which he must have. I always say the advantage and the disadvantage of the authoritarians over democracy is that democracies want peace and authoritarians want victory. And that is exactly what we have there.
Man, that is that's sobering for sure. You know, it's a really quick question. How can people keep up with your work and follow you and follow what you're doing in your research? Where can they go to get more of what you're writing?
Well, thanks for the question. So they can get on the AEI.org site and ask, type my name. They'll see everything I do. I am on Twitter, or currently X, at RTTT, which is Roads to the Temple. Leon Aron at RTTT. We are launching the book on the 23rd of October. They can actually watch it if they can't come personally. They can get on the AEI site. There's a link, and they could see my conversation and hear my conversation with Corey Shaki, who is the Director of Foreign Policy and Defense.
Oh, that's so great. Well, thank you so much
thank you
for being on. We'll have to have you on again after October to talk even more depth about your book. We would love to do that. And so, guys, thank you for joining us today. And if you're watching on YouTube, thanks for watching with us. And until we meet next time, don't let your conversations be left or right, but up. All right, guys, have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.